Bill, you're embarrassing me. You've got a jacket on.
Well, I couldn't find my bow tie. Of course, I haven't seen it for 50 years, so I'm surprised.
I understand. I understand.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'm showing 4:30, so unless there's some reason someone can tell me we're waiting for somebody, shall we go ahead?
Good.
Dane, do you know anyone that's supposed to be on that's not on yet?
No, and since you're just getting ready to call this to order, I just want to make it clear, since we're going to record this meeting and post it, that I am the Ethics Review Board General Counsel and Executive Administrator, but I'm just here to facilitate this meeting with the Zoom conference, posting the agenda. Neither I nor anybody at the ERB has any role in this. This is an independent committee, and I'm just here to facilitate this. So having said that, I'll just fade into the background and watch and let you all have your meeting.
And if we have a problem, we can call on you, right?
I'm here for any technical problem.
A technical problem.
Right.
All right. Well, that's good to know. And as Dane said, this meeting is being recorded, video and sound, and will be posted, as I understand, on the Ethics Review Board website. Correct, Dane? One last thing. Right. So we'll always have that record. I'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. For those who don't know me, I'm Harry Blumenthal. I'm chair of our committee by virtue of the fact that I was elected by, or appointed through election by the city council. I want to welcome everyone. I think these things, or at least I find them, are a little awkward at some times, so we'll try to speak up if you want to speak. I'd like to go about this in the order of the agenda because I think it's more difficult. I might not be able to see someone who wants to say something, but if you say something, I'll certainly write it down and keep it. I'd like to just start, if I may, just for a moment, to speak on behalf of Bill and me, because we want to express our thanks to Ashley. Ashley Barriere has been our wordsmith. She's been able to construct from our, what I would say, often incoherent mumblings, or at least mine, a cogent, concise, and coherent statement. And Ashley just did unexcelled, and we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
From Bill too.
Harry, I don't want to butt in, but before you all can start this meeting on Zoom, you're going to have to certify that we're doing it by Zoom because of the COVID emergency. Otherwise, it would have to be live.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Dana. I appreciate it. We are doing this meeting by Zoom, not as our first choice, but as is required because we cannot have an open public meeting because of the COVID-19 emergency. Correct? That take care of it. All right. Just to welcome everyone here. I think probably we know the members of our committee, but just to be sure, it's a three-person committee. I'm elected as the representative for the city council. Bill Banna, as many of you know, is a representative of the Ethics Review Board, and Ashley Barriere is the appointee of the mayor. So that is how we are together. And we do owe some thanks to Dane for just nothing other, I don't mean nothing other, but helping us facilitate the technical aspects of this meeting. We're gonna follow the agenda. The first part would be some comments concerning the annual report by members of our committee. We'll give ample opportunity, of course, to respond to it. I'm going to just start off by discussing two, what I would, for lack of a better term, overarching issues that were mentioned several times in the response to our report by Mr. Derry, the Office of Inspector General. I just want to say that we take our responsibilities very seriously. We do everything we can to be objective, in fact, fair, even-handed. We even, at our very first meeting before we couldn't meet anymore in person in March, talked about the need to be sure that we scrutinize the report and comment favorably on everything that we thought was done well, and there were many, and we so stated. Many things that are that we think merited our compliments, and of course some things that we thought merited, for lack of a better word, our criticism. We are there was a feeling that that we should have used different standards in our investigation, our research, whatever you want to call it, in our analyzation of the report. But I want to point out that we are, of course, a pro bono citizens committee. We're not auditors, we're not investigators, we're not CPAs. Two of us are lawyers, I'm merely a business person. But we feel that we're appointed to be sort of a common sense citizens committee to respond. The Association of Inspector Generals does, by mandate of the ordinance, a review every 3 years on what we would call the procedures and the processes. And the Orleans Inspector General's office got a raving reviews. But just remember that the ordinance speaks to the, let's say, for example, the qualifications for the Inspector General. And of course, Mr. Derry is well qualified. It's got a list of things that he must have done, which I know he has. I don't mean like a qualified candidate, hold a bachelor's degree, at least 5 years experience in various, as a federal officer, a judge, blah, blah, blah. I mean that just because I want to go through it quickly. When it gets to the qualifications, and I'm going to read this for our citizens committee, their number one qualification: committee members must be domiciled in Orleans Parish. There is no number two. There's no other requirement. So we are not in the business of doing investigations in accord with the, I forget what standard of operating procedures for the Association of Independent Inspector Generals, and I may have that name wrong and probably do. Association of Inspector Generals. The other thing is, the other point I would make, and it'll be a quick one, is we did not choose to meet with the Inspector General. We didn't do it last time after the report came out. It's our feeling that the report is a public document that is meant for the citizens of New Orleans. And therefore, it's not our job to explain it, to clarify it, to make it more transparent. It's our job to observe the report, study it. That's what our job is, to study the annual reports and the reports of the Inspector General through 2019 and make our common sense, in the best interests of the city, comments. And that's why we chose not to do that. It seems to us that the report should stand of and by itself. If it needs to be explained, then that's a problem. That's not our problem. So I wanted to, we shouldn't have to interpret it. Bill or Ashley, do you want to add to that, those comments at all?
Nothing here.
Ashley?
I just wanted to say I agree with Harry, my colleague Harry's comments, and I think just as an overarching matter from the tone of the response of the OIG's response to our report, there did seem to be some confusion as to what our role is. And the ordinance, I think, makes clear that given the fact that the OIG is established and is almost completely, as I understand it, independent of other governmental entities. It's not dependent on city council or the mayor for its funding. It has permanent funding set at 0.55% of the budget. And that makes sense, as the OIG should be an independent arm to investigate and weed out fraud or investigate other city entities. But that being said, the ordinance does call for various oversight of the OIG. The Ethics Review Board has some oversight, but then specifically it establishes that, as Harry mentioned, that the Association of Inspector Generals would conduct a review every 3 years, and that this committee, as we've said, of New Orleans citizens would review the published reports every year. The ordinance makes clear that we just review the published reports. So we don't otherwise review anything outside those reports or confirm information contained in those reports with your office. And so I think to that end, we're supposed to be what I would call a common sense check on the OIG. We raise common sense observations or concerns. And I think that's what we did in our report. And then we're supposed to present that at a public meeting, which is what is happening right now. So to that end, we're not supposed to apply professional auditing standards. We're not trained in that. And we're not otherwise supposed to conduct reviews of the OIG's, interviews at the OIG's office, because I think that's better suited to and called for by the Association of Inspector Generals to do every 3 years. So I just think going forward, I would ask that the OIG take the QAC's, our committee's observations and questions seriously, and to not dismiss them out of hand or not provide an explanation simply because we didn't apply these professional standards or take the time to meet with folks from your office, because that's not our role here. We're simply, again, representing the citizens of New Orleans and just asking common sense questions and observations. And with that, I'll yield it back to Harry.
Thanks, Ashley. So what we can do is to go over the report, but it doesn't make much sense. We've given our report, and there's a response. I would suggest, unless Ashley or Bill feel differently, rather than just go down the report point by point by point, let's make our comments, and then we can talk about the conclusions and recommendations, and then the next item on the agenda would be for the Inspector General and his or her representatives to respond, say something, whatever they want. Does that sound reasonable to?
Sure.
Okay. Does anyone want to hear anything about our individual comments? They're already in writing. If not hearing nothing, I think Ashley, you want to go first on the items you were going to discuss?
Sure. I guess the first item and again, I think as Harry said, we're just going to highlight a few things. The first item was the office's productivity for the year of 2019. As we noted in our report, there was a sharp increase in reports from 2018 to 2019, and we applaud that work. And we think, as noted in our report, that the OIG did some excellent work this year, put out some truly substantive reports that tackled important issues and that are important for the city and the citizens of New Orleans. And we commend the office on that and hope that work continues in the future. We still did, however, have some concerns about the productivity of the OIG, and that it only produced 7 reports in 2019, of which we considered 5 to be significant reports. To this point, although not included in your report, given the OIG's 0.55% established budget, has a budget, we believe, of it had a budget of $3.84 million approximately for the year 2019, which is a significant amount of money. We just question whether the OIG's output last year is commensurate with that big of a budget. That being said, we recognize Mr. Harper was, I believe, came onboarded in 2018. There's already been a significant increase in the output, and we just hope that work continues and that you continue to put out more reports like you did in 2019. The second point that I'm going to discuss is the fact that the annual report failed to identify the cost incurred in undertaking investigations in 2019. As we noted in our report, the OIG's failure to include costs incurred in the annual report we found to be troubling because it's explicitly called for that the OIG will include that figure in its annual report in the ordinance. So in our opinion, the OIG's failure to include this figure constitutes a violation of the ordinance. And as noted in our report, we believe that the ordinance requires this information because it promotes transparency for citizens to be able to assess how much you spent over the course of the year given your budget. And given the fact that it is the OIG's job to ensure transparency and that entities compliance with the law, it is troubling that the OIG did not itself observe the ordinance and include costs incurred in its annual report. That I think more troubling to us, though, is actually on page 9 of the OIG's written response to our report. The OIG stated that the OIG actually does not track such data of costs incurred. We again reviewed the ordinance, and section 11 of the ordinance actually requires the OIG, and I quote, to maintain information regarding the cost of investigations. So going forward, we would recommend that you do track these costs and include that in your report going forward to ensure that you are in compliance with the ordinance. And those are the only 2 points I wanted to raise. So Harry or Bill, if you want to continue.
No, I don't think. I think that covers what our concerns are. That you know the violations of the ordinance, to use a very blunt term, are concerning. And I guess that's, as the old saying goes, who watches the watchman, and that's what we're trying to do. Bill, did you?
Yes. A couple of comments, if I could.
Sure.
Thank you. For 2019, the OIG was provided, as Ashley just stated, of a significant budget for his work, over $3 million, 3.8, I believe. So a fair question is, what did we, as Mary said, we represent the cities of New Orleans, what did we, the citizens of New Orleans, get for our money? And if more and more people would examine that question, I think that would be helpful. We tried to do it as the committee. Also for 2019, and the OIG tells us in his report, which we completely accept, he had a skilled and experienced staff to assist him in his work. Excellent. A fair question. How did the OIG utilize those excellent resources? And finally, another fair question. The ordinance states that he has the discretion to initiate, repeat, initiate, as well as conduct investigations, audits, inspections, and performance reviews. Question, how did he exercise that discretion? Well, that's what we've tried to look into. And it was our overall thinking on one point that the review committee is saying that our inspector general should take that in excess of $3 million budget and that talented staff as best he can and focus on major matters involving significant issues. And he did partially. Ashley referred to a couple things we've commended him on. Sewage and Water Board, Audubon. I mean, there's some excellent work there in his report. But we also feel that two of the matters were very routine and involved no missing money, no hint of corruption, but yet took a lot of time and effort from his staff and work to investigate. They involve a couple lower level managers at the city's Department of Health mishandled a couple of personnel matters. They're very routine. This sort of thing happens in different companies and organizations all over the country. But we just felt that when the Inspector General became aware of those, perhaps the thing to do was a quick referral to the city's HR department, skilled in these personnel matters, a higher level DOH manager, to get the thing quickly resolved. Instead, in one instance, it occurred in 2016, and 3 years later, it's investigated and reported on by the Inspector General. So our only point here is we just like to see the excellent resources, we think most fair amount of money available should be devoted to, as best he can, major matters, significant issues. That would be the way to handle this job. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you. The one other point that we wanted to raise was the issue of expenses recovered. Certainly, we realize that that's not the only issue. I mean, for example, the report on the Sewage and Water Board and their auditing committee, or lack thereof of activities in the auditing committee, is an important point. And many things don't have monetary dollars attached. The comment that we make about the expenses recovered is that in the report at the bottom of one of the pages, it mentioned the total figure of $1,487,696. It's fair to say that that's legitimate, but the Audubon portion, which was exactly 50%, give or take a few decimal points, is still that was a very good and legitimate report, and it's a question that needs to be asked: is the management arrangement of the Audubon Commission and the Audubon Institute correct? And have the monies spent been correct? They vigorously say that everything is great, or not everything, but most things. And it's up in the air. I think we're waiting for a determination by the state attorney general. So it's a questionable cost, which is legitimate to include, but might have been a footnote on the fact that it is indeed questionable. It was stated, but in a footnote. The traffic cameras is an excellent report. I might personally, but not everyone, quibble with the fact that it was thrown into 2019 when it was released in January 30th of 2020. But I just think we think that should not be, for lack of a better term, buried in a footnote, but should have been part of the report itself. If there are some questions about those dollars received. And just one other point, I'm not sure it was touched on, Ashley, I think, speaking of the cyber attack delayed the release of the traffic report. I'm not sure why, but it did. And we certainly take Mr. Harper at his word for that. But he was able by January 30th to release the report. And he actually signed off on it on January 30th, that there were no conflicts, etc. But by March 30th, when the annual report was done, he still was still not able to track the expenses incurred because of the cyber attack. So there's something that needs further investigation or explanation as far as that goes. And I, at least as an old businessman, would say, shouldn't that have been made clear? And wouldn't there have been some financial statements, if not monthly, quarterly, that could have been put in there, and some explanation as to why, for the second year in a row, that was not in the report when it's mandated by the report. I think the next thing we'd like to do is take our report and just go to the bottom and just talk about our recommendations for just a minute. And Ashley, do you want to do that? Or some of it we've already covered, so we don't want to prolong this. Ashley, did you want to do any of that, or?
Sure. I think, yeah, some of it's already been covered. I think, again, we would say ask that, or would recommend in the future that for annual reports to comply with the ordinance and include costs incurred and costs recovered. We also think, although not explicitly required by the ordinance, it would be helpful if the OIG included its annual budget for the year and how the budget was allocated throughout the year, just again to promote transparency. As Bill touched on, it would be helpful if there's a section on prioritization, just to give, again, us who are just citizens in New Orleans with no formal training, how the OIG prioritizes investigations. It's been done in prior reports that there's just a little more background information as to the various sections in the OIG and what kind of work they do, just again to provide baseline knowledge to citizens about what work you do. And on the same vein, also to just include a few more details and definitions in the report to make it accessible to citizens who aren't as familiar with the various professional and standards terms that are used in the recommendations. I do again want to reiterate that we thought the OIG did some truly excellent work this year, and hope it will continue.
Bill, did you have any?
I do not. Thank you.
Sure. And our conclusion, I think we've really taken care of. So I think that concludes agenda item number 3. And Mr. Harper, if you'd like to take over now and say what you would like to say.
First of all, let me say the same thing I said at the beginning of our last Ethics Review Board meeting. Can you hear me? Hopefully
I can, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We are in the midst of the most serious public health crisis in over 100 years in this country. I am proud to be a member of the public servants who make up the city of New Orleans government because of the work, not that we're doing, but to praise the work of those individuals who every day are putting their life literally at risk to serve the people of this community. We take our responsibilities very seriously. And while we had certain improvements and accomplishments, the praise that is inherent many times in an annual report, I felt and still feel that way, needed to be muted this year. So we accept both the compliments and can respond to the concerns raised by the committee. But the overarching statement in that Inspector General's annual report was that there are people who are just doing their job every day. They should be counted as not only essential, but as, if you're going to use the overused term, but it's overused because it's true, they are the true heroes, and they are doing it right now. So for the sake of at least an opening kind of remark, the fact that we had less facts or wasn't as glossy as previous reports, that was my decision, that in this particular instance, our mission isn't accomplished. Our mission is just beginning. Now, I also want to introduce the other members of my team, the executive team that are on the call with us. You're going to hear from them as need be to flesh out some of the things that we've said. Before I say anything else, though, I want to thank the members of the Quality Assurance Review Advisory Committee for your hard work. We welcome feedback from the public. That's been the foundation of my administration of this very important duty from the very beginning. I must say, though, that you used the term several times in your presentation, common sense. Now, you, as you pointed out, Mr. Blumenthal, know that I'm an old trial lawyer, getting older by the day, which is just fine. But one of the first instructions by a judge to a jury is that I am going to be the dictator of the law, the standards. You are allowed, though, to use your common sense. We submit that it doesn't make common sense not to first engage in some dialogue with the subject of any kind of analysis and review before you make public your concerns, etc. Now, I am, in this case, holding you as being appointed by the mayor, the city council, and the ethics review board to a higher standard than, say, people I meet on the street, because you are very talented, experienced, etc. But I would submit it makes no common sense to publish a document without regard to what standards or methodology you are going to use, but more important, that didn't do the common sense thing. I'm not worried about the criticism, we take that every day. But the common sense approach, as demonstrated by the previous quality assurance review committees, the last one of which was in 2014 that we have a report, the one before that was in 2012, engaged in a dialogue with the then Inspector General. Obviously, the one in 2014 included the previous Inspector General. We would urge you to consider using your own terminology, that if you were to be given your role in a courtroom as a juror, you would carry it out to the best of your ability. And when the judge told you that you can use your common sense but not ignore the law, that would, what those two are not competing, they are in fact, quite frankly, they make no sense without being a joint approach. So when I use that term, and we did respond in a very lengthy way, a robust way, we use the term common sense. We went back and looked at the quality assurance review committees. We would have liked to have engaged in at least some discussion before you put pen to paper. To use another cliche, but that's why it's a cliche, you can't unring the bell. And more importantly, the public would, in our view, have been better served with that kind of dialogue rather than doing it as you approach it. But we would ask then, and we're going to make this recommendation to the Ethics Review Board, and I plan on at least discussing it with the members of the City Council, et cetera, that any future quality assurance review committees be given that as their mandate. Use your common sense. We don't expect you to understand all of the legal niceties, or in our case, the word standards, but our robust response was because we could not discern what the methodology and approach you used in order to make those determinations. And Ms. Barrier, you're a fine lawyer. You use the word, we violated the ordinance by not referring to costs incurred in our annual report. Violated has a true meaning to the public and in the common sense. That means that there was some knowing act done by someone with the intent, maybe not specific intent, to violate that particular ordinance. The fact is I'm going to go over in some detail, we did not have budget to actual figures on March 31st. And had you called us, we would have told you that because of the reasons you've already pointed out, Mr. Blumenthal, let's just go down the list. The cyber attack, the unfortunate and tragic events surrounding the collapse of the Hard Rock construction site. And then the one that you didn't know about, but we would have told you about, was the transition to a brand new financial system called BRASS, that's the name for it, vernacular, which the city went through. For a period of time, the city was unable to generate budget to actual figures. So had you asked, we would have told you that on March 31st, we couldn't have put a number in there unless it was something that we pulled out of the air. Since our annual report, we've had numerous conversations with the individuals. Hold on, I'm having a technical difficulty with the city government. And we were able to determine, and these are rough figures, they have not been audited, that the Office of Inspector General returned to the general fund over $1 million for the calendar year 2019. I would ask you to look at all of your comments, opinions, or in this case, your common sense approach, and see if you shouldn't have changed some of the conclusions you made about our productivity. Now, I want to address just one other thing. On the call with me is Patrice Sullivan, who is our general counsel. You met Patrice last year. She is a veteran attorney, having spent over 30 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office. She became a subject matter expert in the prosecution of corruption cases, particularly in the area of healthcare fraud. She's brought a wealth of talent and energy and expertise and was critical in us having the productivity we did have. You also met Larry Douglas, who, among other things, is a 20-plus year audit, review, and evaluation specialist. He holds a certification as a certified information systems auditor. And in addition to that, took on the role of managing both the audit and the evaluation group. And finally, you've not met, but you're going to hear from today, Ed Michelle, who joined us in November of 2019. Among other things, Ed, as you saw in the annual report, is a 23-year veteran of the FBI. He was the assistant special agent in charge for the Houston division, one of the larger divisions in the country. He supervised hundreds of individuals conducting all kinds of investigations under the jurisdiction of the Justice Department and of the FBI's mandate. He also brings to us a New Orleans background, having served for several years with the Tulane Police Department and with the NOPD. So he knows what it's like in terms of being on the streets and dealing with trying to keep the peace and enforce the law. Now, without their help and the help of many other people whose names I'm not going to go into, we wouldn't have had the production that we did have. Now, I'm going to let each of the members of my team have an opportunity to go into some detail. But the reason for the robust, and I'm speaking directly to you, Ms. Barrier, you did an excellent job, as far as I'm concerned, in conceptualizing and laying to bear in a written form what is cogent, and in this case, while we take exception to the conclusions, it is understandable, except for and we submit it is criticism, that we see common sense and observing some standards as being one and the same. They can't go along without each other. So we live by being consistent, applying professional standards that we know are just the minimum level of performance that we have to meet. And then by being able to point to that. So our uses of the word may have violated versus violated, you would be surprised, I'm looking at you, Mr. Blumenthal, how long we debate that. In the Audubon case that I can talk about, where the audit report has been issued, for example, it is an unsettled question, but
Correct.
the Inspector General made a call. In other words, it hasn't been settled by a court of law.
Right.
We do believe that we're on sound ground, but the real message of that first phase of the report is that contract needs to be reviewed by the elected officials responsible for the taxpayers and how money is being used. And they make a decision whether it should be a management agreement or some other hybrid or some other fact. We have presented that, and as you will see in the coming weeks with the, probably in 60 to 90 days with what we're calling Audubon 2 and 3, we continue perhaps to have disagreements, but it is all about making sure that the people responsible, that is the elected officials, have information they can rely upon. So it's based not only on the application of those consistent standards, but also on our professional gathering of evidence to back up our views. Let me try to attempt to be brief, as I have this in bullet point form, and then of course we want to engage in some dialogue. And again, I'm going to ask Patrice, Ed, and Larry to follow up and make sure there are not important points that I leave out. And I wrote this down so that I wouldn't get too long-winded, but I don't get paid by the word. Sometimes people say that I should, because then I'd be very, very wealthy and in Forbes. The ordinance is silent on the issue of whether the Quality Assurance Review Committee should use some set of particular standards to ensure continuity and also the weight that should be given to its opinions. We looked at the 2014 report, and that particular Quark report or group in addition to other things, noted specifically that they followed the standards similar to what we are required to follow in our, I'm going to call them evaluations, to a lesser extent though, to what we call management reviews, or as you referred to in the 2016 report, public letters. We feel and believe that the failure to engage in those discussions to provide context to our work did not mean that your report or your advisory committee suggestions do not have merit, but that the failure to do so is not comport with common sense, nor does it give the public, and we are holding you to a higher standard. You didn't take an oath to follow the judge's law or to apply certain standards, and we'll address that later. For example, the second year Quark had no direct conversation with myself or any member of our staff. You mentioned in a critical remark that we could have just picked up the phone, called the HR department and said, hey, look, take care of this. We disagree with that. We used our professional discretion. We were asked to show if there have been any violations of policy, rules, or procedure. But in this instance, if you had picked up the phone, we believe your conclusions should have or would have been different. Because we didn't have that opportunity to respond either this year or last year, we believe that in order for us to meet our high standard of responsibility to the public, that the criticisms regarding, for example, the investigations division would have been more easily or shortly explained rather than the way that we had to in our report. I know that you can't unring the bell. I'm using that cliche. But in this particular instance, we feel that a robust response was necessary to show that. Now, I mentioned the budget issue and the fact that at the time of publication, we did not have budget to actuals. I want to thank the members of the budget office and the comptroller's office for providing us with numbers, but I would be less than transparent if I didn't say we're still having issues. This is a technical issue probably best left to our investigations division. The intent when we said we couldn't show you costs incurred per investigation is because we don't really track that at the granular level to sufficiently meet our standards of using that as a number. The number that I gave you, having gone to budget, to the comptroller's office, we'll have a follow-up meeting with the CFO of the budget for the Inspector General's office being $3.8 million per year is really the place to start in terms of explaining how the city budgets and how we budget. I'm not going to go into great detail, but that 3.8 figure, for example, includes, Ms. Barrier, $400,000 that the city continues to track based upon our memorandum of understanding with the airport board, which in 2013 said they wanted an inspector general to be present, embedded, to review invoices and provide oversight during the construction of the new terminal. We have said before, we only had one person there, but we noted, not in writing, but I note just for the people who are listening in, there was no mention of the construction fraud division quarterly reports, which are available on our website. Those are reports that should have been included in your body of work, but they would have reflected the great value that the members of the board, including the executive director of the airport, gave to the Inspector General's office for providing that service. We noted in our report, of course, that we are continuing to discuss with them whether that model will work going forward. And finally, before I do my roundtable, going first to Patrice, then to Larry, and finally to Ed, I take exception to comparing the 2016 productivity, however you define that, with 2019, because at that time, the Inspector General's office had at least 8 or 9 people in the evaluation group. The audit group was limited to 4. The investigative group was about the same size, but you also had an executive team, which I can't speak to their qualifications from a personal standpoint, but we did not have an executive team in place for a significant period of the time. Without Ms. Sullivan, without Mr. Douglas, who's brought significant changes, and now under Ed Michelle's supervision, I'll just say it. I can't guarantee anything because some of the circumstances that occurred in 2019 that we think impacted productivity as defined by the number of reports could occur. But this city deserves us to do our very best and do our jobs at all times. May I have just a moment? I want to make sure. In fact, I will just, in the interest of time, Patrice, did you want to have any comments to add about some of the specific matters? For example, if you want to speak to your review of the former Quark reports, we're going to make that recommendation to this group and then at the Ethics Review Board meeting, or anything else.
Yes. So after last year's meeting, last year's review, I wasn't here for the actual review, but I was here for this meeting that occurred. And so we did take all that. We listened to everything you said and tried to do better. But in doing that, we looked at some of the other reports, because we do not suggest that you should be held to an AIG standard, a Green Book standard, a Yellow Book standard. But as you brought up, we would like to be held to a common sense standard. And in that regard, if you've said today, and I completely agree that you're not CPAs, you're not auditors, you're not evaluators, then would it not be a common sense approach, if there's perhaps something you don't understand or you don't think is significant, that you might ask us? Because as Mr. Harper said, the common sense approach is something that every federal judge in every trial I've ever done has told the juror to use, except that juror can't ask questions that are beyond the record. You can. The ordinance tells you that you're to review our reports, and if you don't understand them, there's nothing in the ordinance that says you can't ask us what that means. And by that, I mean that for the significance of the investigative reports, for instance, what you may not be aware of, one example of human resources. If the leader of human resources has reached out to the Office of Inspector General and asked us to look into something, and indeed they're the one that made the complaint, that is now pretty much taken away or put into perspective, into context, one of your objections to it. You know, the importance. Why can't we just go to human resources? That is not as simple as you might say. Civil service is involved. Classified employees are involved. Things that the human resources and the head of that department would have considered. You could have asked that of us, and we could have put that in perspective for you. The employees that were at issue, yes, it may have been an old report, but those employees are still there. Those employees disagree with management's perspective of the rule that we're reviewing. And on top of that, when we start the review, we don't know whether it's a small matter or it's going to blossom into a bigger matter. So the report, our letters, will include all of our underlying investigation, our reports of investigation, any data we've compiled, and it's all available to the public with few exceptions that are set forth in the revised statute. So I'm suggesting to you that even though we're not expecting you to be CPAs or anything like that, we could have given you context. And in doing so, you would have, hopefully considered what we had to say. Now, in 2012, I've got here notes from the chairman of the committee from the 2012 Quality Assurance Review Committee. And he stated his objective in doing what you guys are doing was to review our reports, to review the quality of our reports, not the significance, not should we have done them. And the last thing he says here, that committee member, was, and I quote, "Overall, the process worked well. In the future, the committee may wish to consider distributing a draft of our report in advance to the Inspector General to solicit his comments before the report is submitted. The city statute is unclear on this point." So there's no standard that requires you to do it. but it is a standard that we're required to work by. And we asked last year for the opportunity to respond and for you to incorporate our response into your report and to consider it and respond to it like we will with any other report that we put out. So I did want to mention that. I would ask that, or I would suggest that you don't have to talk to us, but if you are putting out there today that you don't have the expertise that some of the people here have, that would have been a helpful conversation and it would have brought transparency to it. And I don't understand how any of the committee members could not see how, even though you're not required to talk to us, it might have been helpful. So that's, unless Mr. Harper, you have something else you would like me to specifically address. Mr. Harper, you're muted.
All right, Larry. Thank you, Patrice. Larry, did you have any additional? Larry Douglas.
Okay, well, good afternoon. And to piggyback off of what Inspector General Harper said, as well as Ms. Sullivan, we thank you for your review of our operations. There are some things and takeaways that we can learn from it, for sure. I would be remiss if I didn't chime in on what Ms. Sullivan said with respect to some of the need for having discussions with OIG management to ensure that you have a true contextual perspective of what the report should look like and the discussions thereof. Specifically with our audits and investigations, the whole purpose of doing our audit is to make sure that we get it right. We communicate factual information, and I believe it was, I think it may have been Mr. Blumenthal who may have mentioned that it wasn't, he felt that it wasn't his job to explain it. I would agree with that, because part of my job in audit and investigation, anytime we put a report out, is for it to be explained. When we are doing audits, the whole thrust of what we're doing, the reason why we're doing what our audit objective is, and the scope, framework, and the methodology for doing so. In that, it is crucial that we have conversations with management of, for example, Sewage and Water Board. We could not have done that report with the framework and the perspective and the structural content of their operations of the Internal Audit Division had we not had the discussion with them. We needed to understand what was going on. How were they able to do audits or not able to do audits? And part of that was having my staff have a conversations with their staff. At the point where it took it to the executive level of management, we had that conversation. So I would just respectfully ask that anytime we are discussing things of matter that provides the context to whomever your audience is, that you do display a fact that you did have a conversation. Now, at the end of the day, we can agree, we respect that, no doubt. But in the meantime, in the between time, we need to make sure that in order for our reports to be factually correct, we have to have a conversation with management. So I just would urge you to, as Ms. Sullivan said, you're not obligated, but I would encourage you highly to have a conversation so that we can provide that. And that's pretty much all I have.
Thank you, Larry. Ed?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. First off, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Banter, and Ms. Berrier, thank you for your service. Sincerely appreciate the fact that you are volunteers as well as the ERB, and I have a sincere appreciation for them as well. Before I get started, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfectly. Thank you. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of points. I believe the initial observation that two administrative investigations did not match the gravity of other investigations and that they were routine personnel issues could have been handled through a quick telephone call, I believe perhaps doesn't take into account several issues. First off, our mission is to identify and mitigate fraud, waste, and abuse. And we don't have a sliding scale in this endeavor. Our mission is to mitigate all fraud, waste, and abuse. And we just simply don't have the luxury of choosing which fraud, waste, and abuse to identify and mitigate. Secondly, there are standards associated with conducting these investigations, and they're very deep when it comes to drafting, deciphering, and disseminating the results of our inquiries. By suggesting that we make a quick phone call as the best remedy, it's contrasting to the best practices concerning the principles of investigative techniques that I've learned and have applied over the last 35 years. Very frequently, the matter that we investigate starts out being insignificant until it isn't, which is very often the case. Furthermore, in these times of increasing threats and limited resources, it's strictly incumbent upon us to combine those resources effectively with our local, state, federal, and regulatory partners. But equally important for us is to ensure that we have solid relationships with the individuals that we strive to serve in the city. And so in that endeavor, an educated and an informed public is a safe public. So when we take the time to establish a relationship to meet personally with the head of a city division, such as was the case here, to address their concerns, those relationships are not only formed, but nurtured. These relationships often provide us with a higher capacity to accomplish our mission in a very purposeful fashion. When we have these encounters, be it with a city department chair or a frontline worker, we purposely dispense the indicators of fraud, waste, and abuse. And we do that as we have these interactions. They often yield fruit for us later when these indicators show themselves. Investigations must be conducted in a diligent and complete manner, and the sufficient steps must be taken to ensure the relevant information is collected, drafted, and disseminated. You know, very often the actions that we take will severely impact the reputation and the livelihood of individuals. So we can't be cavalier as we conduct these investigations. We have to be thorough and fair. Evidence must be obtained properly, pertinent issues are resolved, and we must adhere to all pertinent civil, criminal, and/or regulatory remedies as we analyze and apply investigative techniques. Investigative findings, conclusions, and outcomes must be supported by adequate documentation, and sometimes it is difficult to adhere to these standards with simply just a phone call. While criminal and administrative matters tend to be labor intensive, we have taken measures to coordinate these resources effectively to ensure that we are being good stewards with the resources that we have. For instance, we have taken measures to shorten our criminal and our administrative investigations significantly. For instance, we have taken measures to use bulk data analysis into our investigative techniques, which saves us a tremendous amount of time. For instance, we identified multiple sewage and water board employees who were selling brass to a local recycling plant. While this may have seemed insignificant, because brass is about $1.25 a pound. That same brass, when you account for the Clean Water Act to ensure the viability of drinking water, cost the city about $25 a pound. So again, when we first saw a $1.05 to $1.25 a pound, and they were potentially stealing this brass from the city, it wasn't that significant. But when you account for the total amount of money that the city paid for that 1 pound of brass, then it became significant. Finally, as we augment the efficient analysis of electronic information by ensuring our personnel have computer forensic certifications, which we have in this endeavor, has aided us heavily in accomplishing our mission. In one instance, the board assessed our work as minor assistants, but the work of our certified forensic computer examiner was actually crucial in identifying a second subject in a homicide case, which without our examination and the subsequent identification of that second subject could this day still be unknown to law enforcement partners who actually investigated this murder of a New Orleans cab driver and a citizen. Again, we will continue to combine our resources and be mindful of the resources that we have and be good stewards of those resources. And I would just strongly urge the board, if they have any questions to us, that I am always available to answer any and all questions and pursuant to any questions that you may have. That's all I have for now, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Derry, do you have anything else, or anyone else in your organization that would like to say anything? Hello?
And you're muted.
I think, yeah.
I'm muted?
No,
Yes. Derry,
No.
you're muted.
right.
Thank you. Now, let me get serious just for a moment. Jessica Lang is our office manager. She pointed out to me that the cyber attack, of course, also impacted the new financial management system. One of the reasons why, and the ethics review board members who've had to get to listen to me go on and on, that you'll seldom hear me talk about particular matters that are going on in public, is that we might have to look into it later. But the brass system, here's the point, was impacted also by the cyber attack. I wanted to emphasize that it was definitely outside of the city's control. It was an attack. One of the things I give full credit to my predecessors as inspector generals and to the people who made the ordinance possible is that our servers are separate from the city servers. We added an additional server last year, finally got it up and running with all of the little wrinkles ironed out, so that we have an additional layer of protection from those kinds of attacks. But without the city being able to get the information out of the new financial management system, our numbers are still kind of fuzzy. But we have it today stated that over $1 million that was allocated in that 3.8 figure that was in the budget book has been returned to the city coffers to be used as in their discretion. I talked a lot about the common sense, and let me just give you two examples. The traffic camera matter. You correctly pointed out that we issued that report in January, but we did so at the request of the city so that they could have an opportunity to respond. The response we didn't receive. Now, it's within the authority, my authority as Inspector General, to issue a report if it's been presented in preliminary form to the subject of the, in this case, audit, and they've not responded in writing within 30 days. It was at my discretion that we extended that time beyond the 30 days with the proviso that if we didn't have the document by a date certain, we would have to issue our report. You've asked me several questions about how we decide this, et cetera. Some of them I think get into the area of, well, how does the Inspector General go about making the decisions in those cases? In that instance, one of my guiding principles is first, do no harm. If we had issued that traffic camera report without the city being able to address some of the issues, it would have made not only no common sense, it would have caused damage, because it's only thing that the public generally concentrates on is when the first time the bell is rung. One more example. In the Sewage and Water Board case, we took this particular audit to heart. That is the fact that during the period of time that is noted in the audit, there was no functioning internal audit function at the Sewage and Water Board, which is $1 billion operation with serious, more than serious, just very critical responsibilities to the public. We had in that audit a document from the previous executive director that ordered the internal auditor to do no work unless it was approved by them. Also, the point was made that citizens just like you, who are conscientious, who took on these roles knowing that it was going to take up their time, et cetera, had not met for over a year, providing the kind of oversight that wouldn't have let those kinds of activities go on for an extended period of time. That is, the members of that board did not exercise or fully fulfill their responsibilities, and it let fraud go on for some time. We would never be able to calculate the amount of money, but we do know that the current executive director and the senior team have worked to improve that. So I want to end on that note. We sincerely appreciate, even with our remarks, which are going to be reported as highly critical, et cetera, or whichever way it might be reported. I want you to know that we appreciate the opportunity to respond. We definitely appreciate the time and effort that you put into this particular matter. And if you want to meet with me individually or any members of my staff after you finish your responsibilities, we'd be happy to do so. We'll take any questions that you have, because it took a little bit longer than I had anticipated, and we covered a lot of ground.
Bill, Ashley, do you have any questions?
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just quickly on the Department of Health personnel matter, I listened carefully, of course, and appreciate the comments that Patrice and Ed made about their dedication to standards. I get that, but let's look at what we have here. The city has a written policy prohibiting comp time, which is one of the two. Every employer, public and private, should have such a policy because that's the law. It's darn sad that the city HR department is totally unaware of its own written policy, and instead of quickly handling a matter that an employee addressed to them, the HR department, goes to the OIG about a simple HR matter. It just creates a delay for sure, and to me at least, contributes to the very thing that the OIG is attempting to eliminate, waste, inefficiency. Thank you.
Well, we thank you for that comment. I just want to make sure that I said this. The system-wide risk assessment is very dense and it's technical, but one of the underlying issues throughout the city government process is the use of policies or procedures that haven't been reviewed in years and therefore haven't been updated and long since are not being followed. We documented that in some of our follow-up audits. So you hit the nail on the head, but they came to us with that matter and we responded.
Thank you.
Probably all I should say.
Could I just make a quick comment, Harry, Chairman?
Quick, slow, as much as you want.
I just wanted to remark, Mr. Harper, that I thought this dialogue and your explanation of the budget and the million that was returned to the city coffers was really enlightening, and the $400,000 that's allocated to the airport construction, I think, again, is enlightening. And I would just, returning to my initial comments, would encourage in the future reports to have that information in the report so that we have that at our disposal. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, we appreciated you pointing that out. So we'll emphasize it next year because that's what people want to know about.
Well, Ashley, is that you finished? Ashley?
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I'll let me say a few words, and then if we should go to a public comment. First of all, the issue, there's two issues in let's say expenses incurred. One is the fact that you didn't report them. If I don't understand why, if you couldn't report them and it was mandated in the ordinance, you wouldn't say we are required to report the expenses incurred, but we cannot do so for this reason, that reason, or whatever. But to just not do it becomes a violation, frankly, in my opinion, and I guess the most pejorative sense of the word. I can't buy that. I also find this whole argument of comparing your investigations to our review of, because ours is a review of your reports, to say that they're the same thing or require the same type of scrutiny or perusal in the correct sense of the word, it is unconvincing. It's just unconvincing. And And I would say that Ms. Sullivan, in the nicest possible way, what you said was totally unconvincing to me. I mean, I understand everyone is entitled to their own opinions. I'm sure what you said was your honest opinion, but I am unconvinced. I am unconvinced. I guess that I'm gonna say that this whole question, and one other thing, Mr. Harper, the issue on the traffic camera report, it's a wonderful report. The only question I mentioned about that, let's be specific, was whether a report that was released on January 30th, that's the date you signed off on it, whether that legitimately belongs in the expenses recovered for 2019. I mean, that's, if you choose to do it that way, I mean, it doesn't, it's not the end of the world, but that was the point I was making about that. The ordinance also mandates that you maintain information regarding the cost of investigations and cooperate. That's something you say you all have not done. In your response, you said that we do not specifically track such data, but you should. I mean, that's in the ordinance. So those are the types of things that I think, frankly, to use your track, that the Ethics Review Board or the City Council ought to look into.
So with all due respect, again, Mr. Blumenthal, those are your opinions and I respect those, but what Ms. Sullivan presented were facts. The previous quarks, and you don't have to follow their pattern, determine what the standard was. And one of the suggestions by a previous group of citizens like yourself was that we should have a dialogue before you reach a conclusion, which I respect, but I disagree with. At least in terms of the technical point that we were making about tracking it, you notice that we haven't had any discussions about those investigations that I can't talk about. And very similar to the position that some of the federal agencies take to discuss how much time we're spending on those investigations which are already known in the public domain, specifically the safety and permits case and other offshoots of that, would in some way disclose our methods, sources, et cetera, if anybody were to actually try to track them. So that's a discussion I continue to have with other members of the public who not only want to know, well, you got all of those former federal investigators, are you looking into this and looking into that? So my last attempt, at least to try and sway you at least to consider this, is that the time that we spend on each investigation is not tracked exactly enough that we were prepared to do that in the annual report on March 31st. That doesn't mean we can't improve the systems that we have. I think that's well taken. But it is not, I think, at all unfair to say that from a common sense standpoint, you have to understand, or at least accept, that we're working on investigations that we don't even talk about. And to toot the horn a little bit more on the productivity part, even though this wasn't within your 2019 review, I sent letters to the members of the New Orleans City Council on January 28th and to the mayor's office on February 13th, asking them to stand down from conducting investigations that might impede, impair, or somehow the piecemeal disclosure of which could irreparably harm individuals who may or may not have been involved. That to me is a public letter where we did something that was significant and it took time. The investigations noted there are the Safety and Permits Office investigation. There's been already one indictment of an individual, and you'd have to ask the U.S. Attorney's Office to comment on whether there would be more. But I'm saying today, for public consumption and anyone else listening in, a significant amount of our time is spent on those matters that we don't discuss publicly. That's the best I can do.
Okay. I would say that
We'll agree to disagree.
Yes, and I would say that I must need to do better on answering my questions because I didn't hear an answer to them. So the next item on the agenda would be to ask for additional comments by the public. I see on the screen that there's several members of the Ethics Review Board in the conference. If they have any questions or comments, whoever or anyone that we don't know that's a public person on. Any comments?
Mr. Blumenthal, if I could, can you hear me?
Yes, who is this?
It's Michael Cowan.
Oh, hey, hello, Mike.
So listen, just a couple things.
Sure.
First of all, I want to thank the work of this group of unpaid, conscientious citizens who have taken on a difficult task and done their best to do that well. And I'm sure that if they are recruitable for another year, they'll do better. And I believe they'll learn from the feedback that came from the IG and his staff this afternoon. Secondly, I was in City Hall with 2 council members in one of their offices when the legislation for the Inspector General's office was drafted. And it included, of course, the guidelines for the Quality Assurance Committee. The reason that the Quality Assurance Committee was inserted into the language, it was not there originally, is that one of the city councilmen, Councilman Carter, felt that there needed to be another check on what he knew was going to be a very powerful office, the Office of Inspector General. And what we came up with as a group was 3 citizen overseers that would review the Inspector General's report every year and report to the public. The quality assurance body is not a child of the Ethics Review Board. It's its own separate reality.
Absolutely.
It decides what it does unless it's directed to do otherwise by the city council, I assume with input from the mayor and the Ethics Review Board. That's just a useful thing to think in mind. It's wrong to think that the IG or anybody else could come to the Ethics Review Board and say, we want this process to change in the following ways. That's just not how this thing is conceived.
Absolutely.
Finally, a question for Mr. Douglas. Mr. Douglas, I was very happy to hear you say something like, without any doubt, there are things in this report that can help us get better at what we do. Did I hear roughly that right, sir?
That's correct.
Okay, all right. So a comment and then a question. The comment is there's been very little of that kind of response to either of the reports of these groups. And secondly, could you give us an example, please, of how this report can help the OIG get better in some way?
Okay. Let me get to it. I think the Quality Assurance Committee has done a great job again, and they pointed out some things. Again, productivity of the Inspections and Evaluations Department. Although we are staff, we did take note of the fact, and we recognize that they, and I appreciate, their recognition of the fact that we were short-staffed. One of the things that we're taking away from this is how we structure based on the staff and how we can get to it.
I'm sorry, I'm losing you there.
I'm sorry. There's a lot of drop noise in there. I apologize for that. I don't know where it's coming from. But Dr. Cowan, to your point, with respect to the Quality Assurance Review, again, their notation of our productivity in 2019 with the limited staffing. One of the things that we're trying to do and look is ways to improve that based on the current flow. So one of the things that I'm looking at is
Can't hear you.
There's something, there's a buzzing.
Exactly. There is a buzz.
We hear it.
Okay,
You hear it too.
okay, that's fine, that's fine. Thank you, sir.
I keep getting muted, Dane.
Yeah, that's me because I think the buzzing's coming from your house.
My house?
Yeah, so that's why I was
Oh.
muting you.
I have a fan on. Maybe
That's it.
Is that better?
Yeah,
Joy
I
said
think,
this new meeting.
yeah, I went around and muted everybody, and by process of elimination, it was you.
Darn. And I always thought you were a big fan of mine. Oh, well.
You're under
So, Harry,
surveillance, Harry.
Harry, if I might just make one brief comment, this is James Brown. I just want to thank the members of the committee for this very important public service. I know it's a lot of hard work, and you're doing it as citizens. So it's just a wonderful thing that you do, and this is a great piece of accountability, which is very good for the public and very good for the community. And I'm going to defer my substantive comments to the next meeting of the Ethics Review Board, where I understand that the committee's report and the Inspector General's response will be an agenda item at the next Ethics Review Board meeting. Joe, if I think I've got that correct on that. So I'm going to defer my comments to that time. Thank you all again.
Thanks, James. Is there anyone that we don't know out there that would like to make a comment? Member of the public?
I would just like to, again, as my colleagues on the ERB has stated, thank the committee for their work. Being part of volunteer boards and work, I understand the amount of work there, and we appreciate the diligence with that. And I also, like James, have some thoughts though that I think would be more appropriate to be given at the board meeting on next month. But I did want to publicly thank you for your work.
When is your board meeting, by the way? Do you know when the next board meeting is?
Dane, do you have that? Unmute yourself.
Monday, June 29th at 3:30.
And either the city council chambers or by Zoom, right?
Correct.
Okay, well, we appreciate everyone participating and giving us their honest appraisal, good or bad, of our work. We feel very strongly that our job is to review the reports, the annual report and the other reports, not to do our own investigation and so on. We've said that. I don't need to reiterate it. I thank you. And if no one else has anything, Bill, do you have something else? You're muted. You're muted. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Just this session today is quite a contrast to last year's, and just a note of appreciation to Mr. Harper and his staff for listening to our comments, considering the points we made in our report of his report, and engaging in a dialogue. That can be very, very helpful all the way around. So much appreciated.
Thank you, sir.
Ashley?
Nothing further from me. Thanks, Harry.
If no one has anything else, and then this meeting should be adjourned. Thank everyone very, very much for participating and coming. We are deeply appreciative. Thank you.
All right.